Hey there, and welcome to another Ask Me Anything session where I'm answering all your questions about the publishing industry and how to write a better book. Keep the questions coming. I have loved seeing them all come in and hope that my answers have been helpful so far. If you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. And I have a link in the description below to download my free story self-assessment. If you have a work in progress of any kind, I recommend checking that out. It's designed to help you identify the strengths and weaknesses in your own work, which I know can be really difficult to do on your own. It's also going to sign you up to my newsletter that I've been working hard on behind the scenes. That is launching soon with exclusive tips and resources. So let's dive into the first question today. I'm working on my first book and everyone tells me that it's going to be my worst work, and it makes sense considering I'll be much more experienced by my 10th book. However, it's extremely discouraging to write while expecting my blood and sweat to flop. Is there a better way to manage my expectations? So I don't necessarily agree that a writer's first book is always their worst book. I feel like there have been many cases, and I've worked with writers personally in the publishing industry whose first book was quite good and, went on to even become a bestseller. Of course, at the same time, as you grow in your craft and become more skilled as a writer, you're likely going to get better at certain things, but I would try to detach from the sentiment that by default, this is going to be your worst book ever. What if this is actually the book that is the most creative or has the most interesting premise? Maybe the writing isn't as stylized as your writing will be, 10 books down, but there's still merit to this book. So I would encourage you to lean into and embrace this process and allow this book to be whatever it wants to be and not worry about if it ends up being good or bad. What even do those terms mean? It's so hard to determine because writing is a subjective art after all. At the end of the day, write the book you want to write and continue to enjoy the process and allow yourself to evolve as a writer without holding yourself to such high standards before you have even finished this first book. Here's another question. What is your opinion on referencing a TV show or movie as a comparable title when querying an agent, assuming I reference another book title that was represented by that agent? Would it be more appropriate to stick to novel titles entirely? Great question. So TV shows and movies can certainly be used as comps in your query letter. I would recommend, as you said, combining that reference with at least one novel reference as well. Now, I recommend not having more than 3 comparable titles total, so at least make sure you have 1 or 2 novels in there. More and more, the film and TV industry is intertwining with the book industry anyway. Both are ultimately methods of storytelling, and as we know, many books are actually optioned and become the material for Netflix shows and movies. So absolutely feel free to reference them. You said something about using a novel that an agent has represented as a comp. Now, that isn't necessary in all cases. Of course, if you can reference a novel that the agent has represented, then I actually recommend bringing that up at the start of your query. Say something like, I noticed you represented this book and I really enjoyed it, which made me want to reach out to you with my book. If you put it in the comps paragraph, it might come across to the agent like you just put that in there because you know that they represented that book. I really would encourage you to find comps that genuinely reflect your book and are the strongest comparable title in terms of target audience and appealing to a similar readership. It does not necessarily have to be a book that agent represented. Next question here. Hi Alyssa, I'm writing a high fantasy novel with a very large cast of characters and multiple POVs main characters, which all contribute to the overarching plot. This is my debut novel, and I've heard that literary agents prefer that debut writers stick to a single perspective. I know it's hard to get an agent, so I was wondering if I should limit my novel to a single POV to give myself the best chance of being represented. Also, if I stick with multiple POVs, what would be the ideal number of perspectives to avoid discouraging agents from reading my manuscript? So I've never actually heard or experienced the claim that literary agents discourage debut writers from multiple POVs. I can think of several examples from my time in the industry where a literary agent I worked for signed a client whose book was multiple POVs, so that is certainly not the case. I think what the question really comes down to is execution. And with novels that have a lot of POVs, I'm talking like 4 or 5 plus, it can kind of feel like the novel is overburdened, a bit too sprawling, and perhaps unfocused. I think that is ultimately the issue, and maybe that's why you've heard that literary agents don't like debut writers to write multiple POVs, because it's harder to ultimately execute. I will say, as a developmental book editor, streamlining the POVs is actually a very common critique that I give, and I work with writers very frequently on POV. I recently heard another book editor say something that really resonated with me, which is that sometimes what you think is a POV character is actually just a character study that you needed to do to understand what that main character is thinking and feeling, their value system and their motivations within the main narrative, but you don't actually need to show that POV. It's kind of like your own background research. So that could be the case for you. I would challenge you to ask the question, whose story is this really at the end of the day? Is it this one character story? Is it these two character story or three character story? Again, when we're getting into the 4-5 territory, it's not off limits, and certainly you could have maybe an omniscient narration and you're kind of rotating through everyone's heads at any given moment, but if not executed near perfectly, that can be very challenging to pull off effectively because the reader is going to enter your story wanting to find and connect with the main character and the main plot. So the easier it is for you to present that to them and pull that out and draw it out for them, the better. Maybe it would be possible for you to have something like 3 POVs and still incorporate those other characters, but not have them be given so much page time that they have their whole separate storyline. There's also a concern with word count here. I know you didn't bring that up, but you don't want to overload your manuscript with so many points of view that in order to keep it within the standard word count, you actually have to cut out material and then sacrifice some of the richness and robustness of a character's storyline because you just don't have time to go into it. In my experience, it's better to dive deeper into fewer characters than cover so many characters only superficially. Here's a timely question. Is it worth querying in the summer or should I wait until the fall? So it's true that summer is notoriously the slow season in book publishing. That goes for literary agents and editors at publishing houses who the literary agent submits manuscripts to. People are often out of the office. The publishing industry has summer Fridays. So things really tend to slow down and really kick back into gear after Labor Day. What does this mean for your querying strategy? I wouldn't think too much about it. If you're eager to get your queries out and kind of just want them off your desk, then go ahead and send them. Just keep in mind that it's likely going to take the agent a bit longer to respond on top of the length of time we already know agents tend to take to respond to queries. However, if you maybe want to tinker with the manuscript more, maybe you want to revise your query letter, maybe you want to get another beta read, summer would be an excellent time to do so because again, it's probably going to take a few months for the agent to even get back to you. So this could be an excellent opportunity for you to revisit your materials so that back in the fall, you can present them the strongest materials possible. Now, I wouldn't query them right at Labor Day because they're likely going to be inundated again with queries, but maybe, late September would be a good time to focus back on your querying strategy and send out another batch. But again, it's not too big of a deal. It's ultimately just running the risk of your queries sitting there in their inbox a little bit longer. Last question here. My current fictional work in progress is focused around psychology, mental illness, and neuroscience. Once it's done, I'll have multiple beta readers check it out. Some of these beta readers have a degree in psychology. I will also have a freelance editor who has a PhD in neuroscience work on it. Should I mention in my query letter that I had these people work on it? Will it increase my chances of my book being accepted? So I'm going to use this as an opportunity to speak a little bit more broadly about whether or if you need to mention beta readers or critique partners or editors that you've worked with prior to querying. It isn't absolutely necessary, as the main beats of the query that the agent is going to be most interested in are the plot blurb, where you describe your book, and then the sample pages themselves. If either of those two elements of your query letter introduce something that make the agent wonder if you consulted a subject matter expert of some kind, then it would likely be worth referencing that you did work with someone on the manuscript. But if there's nothing really in particular in the plot blurb or in the manuscript that could potentially raise that question to the agent, then you don't necessarily need to mention it. Basically, the question comes down to, why do you feel the need to tell the agent that information? Is there something specific in your plot that could be a bit sensitive or could raise a red flag for them? Could be possible that you can kind of cross that bridge when you get to it if the agent reads the full manuscript or potentially raises that as a concern. You basically want to avoid making the agent wonder why you needed those pairs of eyes on the manuscript without telling them why you needed those pairs of eyes on the manuscript, for instance. If this was a case where you worked with a sensitivity reader because you wanted to ensure that you portrayed a specific character or a specific element of the story authentically, then that might be worth referencing in the query, because the literary agent might immediately wonder, based on the plot blurb, if you had worked with someone on that. But if you worked with someone more generally on a beta read or a critique, then it's not always necessary to mention it in the query. I hope you found today's Q&A session helpful and interesting. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. And don't forget my free story self-assessment in the description below. If you have any other questions for me, leave them in the comments here. This is the queue that I use when I'm going through and answering, and I'd love to hear what you want to learn more about. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.